March 1944. The high plains of Texas stretched flat and endless beneath a sky the color of dry steel. The wind carried dust across the scrubland, coating barbed wire fences and the rows of low wooden barracks behind them. Hereford, one of dozens of prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States, stood far from the front lines, but its watchtowers and double rings of wire made clear it was still a battlefield, only of another kind. On this morning, a column of German prisoners arrived under guard. They marched in boots that still carried the mud of Europe, heads tilted forward, faces set hard against humiliation. Their officers whispered warnings, expect barking commands, maybe fists, certainly a display of American power meant to grind down pride. They braced for it, shouting, insults, perhaps military bands pounding out triumphant marches to remind them of their defeat. What they heard instead was music. It came faintly at first, drifting over the dry air from a loudspeaker fixed near the gate. Not drums, not bugles, not the iron rhythms of martial brass, but a saxophone. A warm, rolling phrase swung into the wind, joined by piano chords and a soft percussion shuffle. Jazz. The tune was light, alive, effortless. It moved differently than anything they had known, a sound without discipline, without the rigid order of marches drilled into their bones. The prisoners faltered in step. Some frowned in confusion. Others glanced at one another, unsure if it was mockery or mistake. And yet the music kept going, playful and unbothered, filling the open Texas sky. One officer of the Wehrmacht, years later in testimony, described the moment with a trace of disbelief. We expected scorn. We expected a parade of victory songs to remind us we were conquered men. Instead, they gave us a music that felt like freedom. That was harder to bear than insults. When the prisoners halted in the yard, the saxophone still carried. The guards did not speak. For a few long seconds, only the music existed, slipping between barracks and razor wire, indifferent to uniforms. The melody ended abruptly, the final note hanging in the air like smoke before dissolving into silence. That silence cut deeper than words. Some of the men stared at the ground, their jaws tight. Others blinked rapidly, eyes wet despite themselves. A few stood stiff with hatred, refusing even to acknowledge the sound. But it had reached them. That much was plain. The American guards, leaning against rifles, watched in quiet curiosity. For them, it was just a record spinning on a phonograph, a tune they might have heard in a bar back home or on the radio during a long drive. They did not think of it as strategy. Yet to the prisoners, the effect was devastating. The music carried something alien, ease, spontaneity, laughter without words. One German sergeant whispered bitterly to another, "This is not music. This is poison." And perhaps in his world, it was. For the Reich had long denounced jazz as degenerate, a product of people it labeled enemies, black musicians, Jewish composers, foreigners. In Germany, such sounds had been driven underground, forbidden by decree. To hear it now, played openly, not as rebellion but as normal life, was to feel the weight of another world pressing in. That evening, in a barack where the heat lingered even after the sun dropped, men argued in low voices. Some swore the Americans meant to humiliate them by stripping away even the dignity of their silence. Others admitted quietly that the tune had stirred something they could not explain, a longing they had not felt since before the war. The camp itself was no paradise. The air was dry and bitter with dust, the bunks crowded, the food coarse. Barbed wire glinted under searchlights, and guards paced steadily with rifles. Yet over all of it, that morning's music lingered. It had broken the expected rhythm of captivity. In the camp records, an American officer wrote a single line that captured the strangeness of that day: the Germans marched in with discipline. The saxophone broke it. For some prisoners, it was the first day they began to sense that America fought not only with weapons, but with culture, that a melody could wound more deeply than a bullet. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. April 1944. The Texas spring brought no relief to the camp. The wind swept hot across the panhandle, carrying with it the smell of dust and cattle. Inside the barbed wire compound, life settled into routines of drills, chores, and the endless wait for a war they could no longer fight. But in the barracks, after roll call and meals of beans and cornbread, something new began to stir. It came first through the speakers mounted near the recreation hall. American records, shellac discs spun on old turntables, poured out music unlike anything the Germans had expected to hear. Not marches. Not folk songs. Jazz. Benny Goodman's clarinet lines skipped like quicksilver, Duke Ellington's orchestration swelled with velvet brass. In the stillness of confinement, the rhythms sounded almost indecent in their freedom. One prisoner, writing in a letter later seized by the censors, described the moment with startling honesty: "We sat on our bunks, listening. For a few minutes, we forgot the war existed. The music was not about nations or uniforms. It was only about movement, about life." The guards noticed, too. An American private assigned to the camp later recalled in his memoirs, "I stood in the corner and watched them. Yesterday these boys had been our enemies. Some had fought in Africa, maybe even fired on men I knew. And there they were, tapping their boots to Glenn Miller, grinning like kids who'd snuck into a dance." But not everyone welcomed it. Among the officers of the Wehrmacht, discipline still reigned. They whispered warnings to the younger men: "Do not listen. This music," they insisted, "was corruption, the art of undesirable races, a weapon more dangerous than bullets." In some barracks, senior NCOs ordered their men to leave whenever records played, branding it degenerate sound. Defiance of Reich doctrine, even here, was treated as betrayal. That tension divided the prisoners. Some obeyed, turning their backs, staring at the floor with clenched jaws whenever the first notes drifted in. Others snuck closer, pretending to clean or repair gear just to remain within earshot. And then there were those who listened openly, heads swaying, feet marking the beat in defiance of their own officers' glares. The Americans saw the cracks widening. To them, the music was just background, entertainment to fill silent nights. Yet in the barracks it became something else, a test of loyalty, a forbidden fruit behind wire. A curious detail surfaced in one guard's recollection. He remembered how a group of prisoners, led by a gaunt man from Hamburg, smuggled scraps of paper to copy down lyrics they barely understood. Words like swing, rhythm, and freedom were scribbled phonetically, practiced under breath. They had no instruments, no training in jazz, yet they sought to capture fragments, as if learning a code. The clash reached its peak one evening when a record of Ellington's band played through the camp loudspeaker. Younger prisoners crowded close, clapping quietly, trying to mimic the syncopated rhythms. An older officer stormed into the barrack, shouting that they were disgracing themselves. He called it music of Jews, of Africans, of criminals, unworthy of German soldiers. The men froze. The record kept spinning. The tension was a taut wire, stretched to breaking. Then something unexpected: one of the youngest prisoners, barely 19, refused to rise. He sat on his bunk, staring straight ahead, foot tapping softly in time with the record. The officer struck him across the face, but the tapping did not stop. The silence after that slap was sharper than the blow itself. In camp archives, an American guard later wrote, "It was the strangest thing. No one spoke, not even us. The record kept going, and that kid just sat there, blood at his lip, and he wouldn't stop keeping time. It was the first time I thought maybe the music meant more than any of us guessed." From then on, listening became dangerous, but irresistible. Some prisoners sneaked into the recreation hall at night to press their ears against the wooden walls, catching muffled notes when guards played records for themselves. Others hummed fragments under their breath while working in the kitchens or repairing fences, fragments quickly silenced if an officer drew near. Jazz in the camp became both gift and weapon. To the Americans, it was routine. To the prisoners, it was a quiet rebellion, a taste of something larger than wire and barracks. In a confiscated letter, one soldier confessed, "We are not supposed to listen. Yet we do, in secret. It is like holding contraband. Perhaps it is a weapon after all, one that pierces us where rifles cannot. The officers tried to crush it, but the music had already slipped beyond their control. In the still nights of the Texas plains, a saxophone phrase or a clarinet riff echoed faintly over the wire, and men lay awake on their bunks, unable to forget it. And so jazz became a secret language in the camp, a rhythm tapped under blankets, a melody hummed behind clenched teeth. Not everyone dared. But enough did that the question lingered, sharp and unspoken, what else might follow if they kept listening? Summer 1944. The sun beat mercilessly on the barracks of Hereford. The wooden walls, already cracked and warped, radiated heat as if the buildings themselves were stoves. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the faint odor of livestock drifting from fields beyond the barbed wire. In this sweltering stillness, the prisoners found small escapes, shade under the eaves, a cigarette rolled from cheap tobacco, or, most dangerous of all, the stolen moments when jazz floated through the camp. By then, letters had become the lifeline. Every prisoner was allowed to write home, their words carefully screened by American censors before passing across the ocean. Most were routine, assurances of health, requests for news, stiffly phrased declarations of loyalty. But tucked among them were fragments that never left Texas, letters pulled aside, marked in red pencil, and stored in government files where they remain to this day. One of those letters, penned by a man from Stuttgart, began innocuously, "Dearest Anna, the camp is as one would expect, dust, drills, nothing more." But a paragraph later, the words shifted, "I have heard a music here unlike anything before. It is free, unbound, without order, and yet it holds you. It makes me wonder what we were told back home, and whether we were told the truth." The letter was seized, stamped withheld. Others followed a similar pattern. A sergeant from Bremen wrote of a clarinet solo he could not forget, "It twists through the air as if mocking the very idea of control. Listening to it, I could not think of Hitler. I could not think of war. Only of life." That letter, too, was intercepted. Rumors spread quickly in the camp. Men whispered that some of their comrades had tried to describe the forbidden music in their letters, only to have those messages vanish. The censorship itself became proof of its power. If the Americans feared the words, then surely the music mattered. Meanwhile, in the dining hall, a discovery altered the rhythm of confinement. Against one wall stood an old upright piano, its varnish chipped, 2 keys missing, the felt inside worn thin. At first it was used only for hymns or stiff German marches. But one evening, when the guards had stepped out, a prisoner sat down and began to experiment. He was no jazz musician, merely a baker's son from Cologne who had taken lessons as a child. Yet with hesitant fingers he tried to mimic the chords he had heard on records, stumbling through syncopations that felt clumsy but alive. A few others gathered, listening in awe as he shaped fragments into something resembling swing. It was rough, halting, but unmistakable. A prisoner later recalled, "It was as if the walls bent outward. For a moment, the wire was gone." The sessions became secret rehearsals. Late at night, when guards were fewer, a small group of prisoners sneaked into the hall. They improvised with what they had, piano, a makeshift drum beaten from a crate, a harmonica bent into strange rhythms. It was not Ellington, not Goodman, but it was theirs. They called it Die Freiheitmusik, freedom music. The irony was sharp, the Americans had not planned any of this. No officer had conceived a scheme of cultural warfare. The first spark had come by chance. A guard, homesick for Chicago, had carried his own records into the camp and played them in the recreation room. What to him was comfort had become, to the prisoners, a crack in the walls of their old world. In one archive folder lies an officer's dry observation: "The Germans appear fascinated by jazz recordings, though their leaders denounce them. Some have attempted to play the music themselves on the mess hall piano." Guards report no discipline problems during such times. The tone is clinical, almost bored, but behind it lived something far more volatile. For not all welcomed the piano sessions. Senior officers in the barracks treated them as sedition. They warned that anyone caught participating would be branded traitor to the fatherland. One night, they burst into the hall, scattering the small circle of players, slamming the piano lid shut with such force the crack would echoed like a gunshot. For days afterward, the men spoke in whispers, fearful of punishment. And yet the music returned. Slowly, cautiously, a note at a time. It returned because it had planted itself deeper than fear. In confiscated drafts of letters never sent, the prisoners wrote words that even they seemed to distrust. Perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps the world we believed in was not the only one. If music can make me doubt, what else might? The censors read them. The guards read them. And then the letters disappeared into folders stamped restricted. Back in the barracks, men lay awake in the heat, sweat rolling down their necks, the sound of that old piano still ringing faintly in their heads. Some tried to push it away, clinging to discipline. Others let it gnaw at them, quietly, dangerously. And soon the whispers turned into questions, questions no soldier was supposed to ask. What if the Reich had lied? What if the enemy's music was not corruption, but truth? Autumn 1944. The Texas nights came early, cool after the crushing heat of summer. Darkness pooled around the barbed wire, broken only by the glow of lamps in the watchtowers. Inside the camp, men returned to their bunks, the day's drills and chores finished. From outside, faint crickets sang in the fields. And then, slipping through the wooden walls of the barracks, came another sound, the unmistakable rhythm of jazz carried on the camp radio. It started with a low swing of bass, the sharp punctuation of brass, and the easy lift of a saxophone weaving above it all. The melody was faint but persistent, threading its way through cracks in the wood, bouncing down narrow aisles between bunks. Prisoners stirred. Some smiled unconsciously, tapping fingers against bed frames. Others sat rigid, frowns hardening in the dim light. Voices rose. "Turn it off," one man snapped in German. "It's the enemy's trick." But another prisoner, younger, laughed quietly. "It's only music." Arguments flared in pockets of the barrack. Men who had once fought shoulder to shoulder now faced each other over a rhythm that refused to be ignored. "This is betrayal," an older non-commissioned officer barked. "We are soldiers of the Reich. This noise is filth." Across from him, a private shook his head, whispering, "No. It's different. It makes me feel alive." The clash echoed louder when the record spun into a faster tempo. A few prisoners began to mark the beat with their feet, hesitant at first, then more boldly, the wooden floor thudding softly in time. Others shouted at them, fists raised, calling them traitors. In the thin light of kerosene lamps, faces flushed with anger or lit with guilty joy. That night, a Wehrmacht officer, formerly of an artillery regiment, opened his journal and wrote in stiff, controlled script, "I see my men dance to the music of a savage race. They lose the discipline that defines us. If this continues, they will forget who they are." The entry, preserved in military archives, is marked with underlined words of disgust, yet behind them lingers the desperation of a man watching loyalty erode. For the Americans, the scene was invisible. To them, it was just another broadcast. A guard off duty had tuned the radio to a station out of Dallas, letting the music drift into the night. He could not see how, in the barracks, the sound carved invisible lines down the middle of the room. The effect was subtle, but corrosive. The strict commands of the Reich, drilled into men from their youth, clashed with syncopated rhythms that carried laughter, improvisation, and ease. For prisoners who had been taught that life was order, discipline, and sacrifice, the music suggested a world that moved differently, a world where freedom was not just an idea but a sound. One prisoner later recalled in testimony, "You could not argue with it. The rhythm pulled at your body before your mind could object. That was why it frightened the officers. They could command words, but they could not command what your foot did under the blanket." The conflict deepened. Some prisoners reported comrades to senior officers, accusing them of succumbing to enemy propaganda. Punishments followed, extra duty, loss of privileges, isolation. Yet the music still seeped through walls at night, still caught men unawares, still turned silence into restless motion. In those weeks, laughter began to appear where before there had been only sullen quiet. Young prisoners mimicked American slang they had overheard from guards. Others joked about forming their own swing band with nothing but spoons and empty tin cans. These were small things, fragile, but they unnerved the older soldiers who clung to the iron frame of discipline. The barracks had become a battlefield. Not one of rifles and grenades, but of rhythm against command, spontaneity against obedience. Every note from the radio was another shell, every burst of laughter another breach in the walls of loyalty. And by the time winter crept closer, it was no longer clear which side was winning. In the official log of the camp, an American officer wrote a dry summary of that autumn: no major incidents. Prisoners divided in attitudes toward music broadcasts. Some show signs of agitation. Others appear calm, even cheerful. The words were clinical, but they concealed the truth that inside those wooden barracks, men fought battles that could never be measured on a report. Because in that place, in that season, war no longer raged between nations. It raged between ideas. Winter 1944-45. The Texas wind turned sharp, cutting through the thin walls of the camp. Frost crept along the edges of windows, and the barracks offered little warmth. Blankets were thin, boots worn from endless pacing on gravel. Men huddled together at night, their breath hanging in pale clouds above the bunks. Even in Texas, the cold could reach inside bones. The dining hall became refuge. Not for food, the beans were the same, the bread dry, but for heat, for company, for the chance to gather beneath dim electric lights. It was here, in the heart of winter, that music returned in a way no one had expected. The Americans had long allowed a radio to play in the mess, filling the silence with programs from Dallas or Oklahoma City. On some evenings, guards brought out records, spinning them while they drank coffee and smoked cigarettes. But this time, something shifted. A group of prisoners stepped forward, not with demands, but with instruments. A piano, repaired clumsily with wire and tape. A battered trumpet, donated by a guard who claimed his brother had left it behind. A clarinet found in a pawn shop in Amarillo. The instruments were offered almost casually, but the effect was anything but. Within days, the prisoners revealed themselves. A former student from Munich, trained at a conservatory before the war. A trumpet player from Bremen, who had once performed in dance halls. Even an officer, stiff and formal in every other setting, admitted he had studied piano before joining the artillery. Together, they began to play, not marches, not hymns, but jazz. At first the sound was clumsy, halting, as if the instruments themselves resisted. Fingers stumbled, rhythms faltered. But then the guards joined in. One tapped a drumbeat on the mess table with spoons, another fetched an old snare drum from storage. Slowly, the music tightened. Saxophone riffs bled into piano chords, percussion kicked the rhythm forward, and something uncanny filled the hall: Germans and Americans, former enemies, playing together. An eyewitness guard described the scene years later. I watched it with my own eyes. A German officer at the piano, an American corporal on drums, and a dozen others crowded around clapping. They laughed together. I thought of the men who died in Africa, in Italy, and I couldn't make sense of it. For a few minutes, the war seemed impossible. The prisoners who listened were divided. Some clapped along, smiling for the first time in months. Others sat stiff, refusing to move, whispering words like propaganda and poison. For them, the sight of comrades playing the enemy's music was unbearable. Reports surfaced of men writing letters denouncing the Americans' psychological tricks, though the censors kept most of those words from reaching Germany. Yet the music kept spreading. Rehearsals were held twice a week in the mess hall. Guards leaned in doorways, nodding along. Prisoners crowded benches, snapping fingers, stamping feet. For those moments, the barbed wire seemed to vanish. The tension was not gone, it only shifted. In some barracks, younger soldiers joked about forming their own bands, while older officers muttered about betrayal. In one intercepted note, a prisoner wrote, "I saw men laughing with Americans. I do not know what to call it. Treason? Or simply human?" The letter was confiscated, but the thought lingered. For the Americans, the music was amusement. For the Germans, it was a fracture. Every chord seemed to press against the discipline drilled into them since youth. Every improvisation defied the order they had been told was the highest virtue. And still, in that cold winter, laughter grew. There was a night when the trumpet cracked a high note and the room erupted in cheers, prisoners pounding the tables in delight, guards laughing so hard one spilled his coffee. For a heartbeat, there were no uniforms, no enemy lines, only men chasing the same rhythm. But not all could forgive it. In the days that followed, whispers spread of prisoners reporting their own comrades for fraternizing. Some feared punishment if their names were carried back to Germany after the war. Others feared something deeper, that the music was changing them in ways they could not reverse. An entry from a German sergeant's diary captures that unease: "It is worse than defeat. Our men forget themselves. They are no longer soldiers. They sway, they smile, they play the enemy's notes. I fear we are losing not to their weapons, but to their spirit." By January, the strange band had a name whispered among the prisoners: Die Draatkapelle, the wire orchestra. It was spoken half in jest, half in awe. Some came just to listen. Others came to despise. But none could deny it had become a force in the camp. One night, when the mess hall emptied, a young prisoner lingered at the piano. He pressed a single chord, let it hang in the cold air, then whispered to a friend, "If music can do this, what else can it do?" The question was dangerous. It hung heavier than the winter air, a question that none dared answer aloud. May 1945. The war in Europe ended not with a shout but with a silence that rolled across the camps like an invisible tide. Word reached Texas slowly, first in guarded announcements from officers, then in fragments from newspapers delivered under watchful eyes. Germany had capitulated. The Reich was gone. For the men behind barbed wire, the news landed like a stone dropped into deep water, no splash, only a ripple that spread through every bunk, every mess line, every restless night. At Hereford, the gates did not open immediately. Formalities had to be observed. Lists were drawn, rail schedules set, orders passed down. The prisoners waited in uncertainty, pacing the same gravel paths they had worn for months, asking each other what would come next. Some dreaded release, fearing what ruins awaited in their hometowns. Others longed for nothing but the chance to step beyond the wire. The Americans prepared them quietly. Medical inspections. Final roll calls. Papers signed with indifferent efficiency. And through it all, the music did not stop. The guards, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, brought the radio out into the open yard. On the day the German surrender was announced officially, a record spun, lilting saxophone, brass rising and falling, a rhythm steady and unbowed. Jazz. The prisoners gathered in knots, staring through the fence toward the speakers. Some folded their arms tightly, refusing to move. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them like the wind itself. A few wept openly, not from joy or sorrow, but from something they could not name. One man later described it in his memoir: "We left America with defeat in our hearts, but the last sound we heard from them was not guns, not orders, not curses. It was music. And it remained with me all my life. For the first time, I understood what freedom felt like, and it did not march, it swung." The departures began in late May. Trucks carried the men to trains, trains carried them to ports, and ships bore them eastward across the Atlantic to a homeland unrecognizable. Cities bombed flat, families displaced, streets haunted by hunger and suspicion. The Reich that had demanded their loyalty no longer existed. But in the minds of some, a different rhythm now pulsed, faint yet insistent, the rhythm of nights spent in a Texas camp where a saxophone had cut through silence. In the camp records, one American officer noted the farewell with an odd detachment: prisoners seemed subdued but orderly. Some requested to hear one last record before departure. Glenn Miller selected. The line is brief, almost bureaucratic, but behind it was a truth. For many of those men, the final memory of captivity was not barbed wire but music drifting into the night. What followed is harder to document, yet the traces remain. In post-war Germany, jazz clubs reopened in ruined basements, often with battered instruments and improvised stages. Among the audiences were former prisoners, men who had once sworn allegiance to a Reich that called this very music degenerate. Now they tapped their feet to it, some even taking up instruments themselves. A handful had learned enough in Texas to stumble through chords and scales, others carried home records traded from guards or scribbled notes of melodies smuggled past censors. Historians have since debated whether this mattered, whether jazz in a POW camp could truly reshape convictions. But the testimony is there, written in fading ink, letters, diaries, recollections recorded decades later. A former sergeant admitted, "I was taught to believe strength was in obedience. Then I heard a music built on improvisation, and I began to think strength might also lie in freedom." Not every man changed. Some returned hardened, clinging to the discipline that had defined them. Yet even they could not erase the memory of the nights when the barracks shook with rhythm, when comrades swayed against orders, when the enemy's culture slipped through cracks no barbed wire could seal. By the summer of 1945, the camp itself was empty, its barracks already beginning to warp in the heat, its fences rusting in the dust. Only the wind remained, carrying faint echoes of what had happened there. Guards moved on to new assignments. The phonographs were packed away. The piano in the mess hall stood silent, its chipped keys collecting dust. But those who had heard it carried the sound across oceans and into the rubble of their homes. One American guard, writing years later, reflected with a mix of wonder and unease, "We thought we were just passing time, giving them something to listen to. We didn't realize it was changing them. Maybe it changed us, too." And so the story closed not with gunfire, but with a record spinning under the Texas sky. What began as background noise had become something far more potent, an invisible weapon, one that left no bodies on the ground but carved scars in the certainty of men. The Reich had tried to erase jazz, to brand it unworthy, dangerous, corrupt. Yet in the stillness of captivity, it had seeped back, note by note, until it lodged itself where ideology could not reach. They had expected marches. They had braced for orders shouted in foreign tongues. Instead, they heard jazz. And in the end, it proved to be the one weapon they could never defeat.